Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That, of course, was Zusha. They have such a distinctive sound. And that song was called Yoel's Nigun. My Hebrew name is Yoel, Joel, right? But the more, Hasidic way to pronounce it would be Yoel or even Yoeli. How you doing? We've got a great show tonight. We're going to be taking a tour of the Holy Temple. To the best of my ability, I am no expert on the architecture and geography of the Holy Temple, but I've been preparing myself today. So we'll do our best, and it's called for, given the page of the Talmud we'll be learning today. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning on a Tuesday night? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Rebecca in LA, Paul in Chicago, Melissa in New York, Bill in Berkeley, Renee in Indy, James in Indy, Stephen in Oklahoma, Gail in Virginia, Tom in Pennsylvania, PK in Colorado, Kelly in Texas, Ann in Merced, Carolyn, shalom from Raleigh. May there be peace in Israel. Amen. Miriam in Colorado. Sharon in New Jersey. Just left a Shiva Mincha, so she went to the afternoon service by a Shiva, a house of mourning. A Shiva for an amazing man, Baruch Dayan Emes. We say Baruch Dayan Emes when we hear of a death. Blessed is the true judge. Steve Califer, may his memory always be for a blessing. Nancy, and I advise, always go to a funeral, to a house of mourning. It's a true kindness. It's a major mitzvah. It really helps to honor the one who has left this world. It helps the family to feel that that person was honored. And there is no greater opportunity to grow in wisdom than to attend a funeral, to go to a house of mourning. Right away resets your priorities. Nancy in North Carolina, John in Sedona, Paula in the great Northwest, Tom in Myrtle Beach, Jill in Illinois, Lucy in Minnesota, Frank in LA, Zach saying shalom, Sandra in Austin, and people greeting each other. Beautiful. Over there on the YouTube side, Michael saying hi, Sally and Nina. Gigi in British Columbia. Lynn in North Texas. Neil in Virginia. And the other Michael in Scranton. Welcome, everybody. All right. I have a lot of teaching tools today. As always, we do, well, first of all, a big Yasher Koach and a thank you to Michael and Jean, or Jeannie, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Schechter, who are dedicating tonight's episode of AT Daily to their friend Rosalie Jaeger, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce, who died on April 1st, 2021. May Rosalie's memory always be for a blessing, and may her neshama have a great aliyah, may her soul have a great elevation in the world of souls, and the learning that we do today, dedicated by Michael and Jean, accrues to the merit of Rosalie, and it may it be an assistance to her in the world of souls. We say amen. And Michael and Jean, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings We thank you for supporting our nonprofit and enabling us to share Torah with the world. And we say Amen. This is AT Daily, a Torah and Talmud show. So we have a spot of Torah before we get into our page of Talmud. I thought this morning when I was in synagogue for morning services, something that I don't usually do after the morning davening, after the morning prayers. There are a few additional readings that one can do if he has time, if he's not in a hurry, after the completion of the morning services. And they're quite beautiful and worth taking a look at least from time to time. So one of these readings is the 6 remembrances. It's printed in the Jewish prayer book because we are commanded to remember certain things. There are 6 commandments of remembrance. The Torah says, you shall remember. And so to help us remember, we remind ourselves every day of the 6 remembrances. 3 of them are positive things to remember. 3 of them are negative things to remember. Obviously, you can learn from both the good things that happen and from the not so good. So what are the 6 remembrances? The first, from Deuteronomy 16, the Exodus from Egypt. That you may remember the day you left the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. So we talk about the Exodus from Egypt during Passover, but really every holiday and every Shabbos we're told to remember that I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from slavery, etc. So we remember the Exodus from Egypt when God reached out and saved us. The revelation at Mount Sinai is the second positive thing we remember, and that's from Deuteronomy 4. Only be careful and watch yourself very closely, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart all the days of your life. You shall make them known to your children and your children's children, the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people before me, and I will let them hear my words, so that they may learn to be in awe of me as long as they live on earth, and they will teach them to their children. So the moment of the revelation at Mount Sinai, it's the second thing we're supposed to remember all the days of our lives and teach to our children. The third remembrance is of a negative, something negative that happened. Remember what Amalek did to you on your way out of Egypt, how he met you on the way, cutting off those who were lagging behind when you were tired and exhausted, and he did not fear God. Right? Like all the nations who became aware that the God of Israel had taken the nation of Israel out from the nation of Egypt with great signs and wonders, the plagues, the parting of the sea, the revelation at Sinai, etc. So everybody else said, yeah, we'll leave these people alone. They seem to be a protected group. But Amalek didn't actually come and go to war with Israel and say, let me take on the armies of Israel and prove that I can destroy Israel. Rather, let me just take out a few of the weak ones at the tail end of the procession. Just kill a few old people and children to show that God's power and God's protection of these people is not absolute. It's just that cynical, sniping, skeptical voice, an actor, who just takes advantage and says, ha, I can do my evil thing and attract some attention to myself. Right? And that was Amalek. And we are told to remember what Amalek did to us all the days of our life, and not to forget to erase the memory of Amalek from this world. So we remember what Amalek did, but that's it, right? That he's remembered within our Torah, but there's no traces of Amalek in the world. The fourth remembrance is another negative, the golden calf. Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God in the wilderness. The fifth is Miriam, the sister of Moses. But unfortunately, what we remember we actually say when we do the song at the sea, also in the daily prayers, how we all sang, and then we remember that Miriam led, the women in dancing with their timbrels. But there was also the incident where Miriam sort of whispered to her brother Aaron about their brother Moses, and what was going on with his wife. It was a little bit of Lashon Hara, and so she was struck with tzara'as, that biblical leprosy, the physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way when you came out of Egypt. She recovered from that, and we remember her as really one of the great heroes of the Jewish people. My daughter's actually, her Hebrew name is Miriam. So she's a great, great hero, but it's a great cautionary tale that no matter how high you rise and how holy you become, it's almost easier to slip, right? When you get to such an exalted state of righteousness and holiness, you can make a mistake because we're human. But God is a God of second chances, and he gave Miriam more than a second chance. And finally, the last remembrance is a positive remembrance. Remember the Sabbath day to hallow it. Right? And we say that, of course, on Shabbos. So those are the 6 constant remembrances. We're supposed to remember this every day of our lives, and reading those reminds us. And then Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, there's a very quick little but beautiful comment about them. These acts of remembrance define 3 positive and 3 negative parameters of Jewish faith and life. Positively, the Exodus reminds us of divine redemption, God saving us in our lives. Sinai, of revelation, God revealing God's self to us, right? God is always waiting for us, and if we will listen to the language of events, we can experience God's presence. And the Sabbath reminds us of creation, right? We all are, every 7 days, we're reminded that God made this world in God's great kindness. Negatively, the golden calf reminds us of our sins against God. Miriam's fate reminds us of our sins against our fellow people, and especially through evil speech. And Amalek's attack on the Israelites showed how a failure to fear God leads to cruelty against human beings, right? People who are unmoored from the eternal values of the divine end up making their own rules, and very often with good intent, imagining some kind of a paradise on earth that they want to create, they end up committing unspeakable cruelty. We look at Stalin and the other communist overreaches. They were going to create that workers' paradise. Very few civilizations in history have exceeded the cruelty and the homicide and genocide of the communist project in the Soviet Union. Tens of millions of people killed. Just a few eggs to make the omelet, right? But unmoored from those eternal values, unspeakable cruelty can easily result. All right. Also, just wanted to mention from today's Aliyah, from today's reading, right, today's 7th of this week's Torah portion, we had the question yesterday. Somebody commented that she was moved by the fact that non-Jews could send offerings into the temple just like Jews could. Only the priests could actually bring the offerings onto the altar. So a regular Jew, in other words, not a Cohen, not a priest, could bring an offering to the temple and hand it over, and then the priest would take care of it and bring it up on the altar. Now, there are various kinds of offerings. And so, for example, sin offerings and guilt offerings, those only apply to Jews because you bring them to comply with certain Torah requirements. But an elevation offering or a burnt offering, an animal that's entirely consumed on the altar as a gift to God, which one can bring, to say thank you or as a vow offering, non-Jews could bring that. And we actually learned that in today's reading. That's Leviticus 22:25. And it's been describing the fact that when the priests bring an offering, an animal sacrifice onto the altar, it must be an unblemished animal. And then the Torah says, and even from a Gentile, you must not offer up the food of your God, from any of these blemished animals. For since they are affected by their mutilation and their blemish, they will not act as an appeasement for you. So the rule is the same for the Gentile as for the Jew. You can't offer a blemished animal on the altar, but from that we learn, so a non-Jew can bring an animal, right? He doesn't actually bring it to the altar, but he can send in an animal, and there we have the text source for that. Okay. Our daf today is page 16, daf Tes Zion, here in Tractate Yoma. We're in chapter 1, now discussing the second Mishna. Generally speaking, we're talking about the preparation of the high priest to fulfill his obligations on behalf of the nation during the Yom Kippur rituals, the Yom Kippur liturgy. When the temple was standing, it hasn't in 2,000 years, but when it did, an atonement was made on behalf of the whole nation through the actions of the high priest on Yom Kippur. And so, of course, there was tremendous preparation for that. The second Mishnah here in chapter 1 details that during the 7 days that the high priest is sequestered in the temple compound, he does all of the avoda, all of the divine service that is normally done by ordinary priests in order to get very facile, very handy with all the job that he's going to have to do on Yom Kippur so that he can do it properly, fluently, efficiently, on time, with elegance, and fully correct, as it were. So he's practicing. Yesterday, in our discussion of that, we saw that there was a contradiction between one Mishnah and another about the order in which these daily practices are done by the ordinary priest during the rest of the year, and then during these 7 days of sequestering and on Yom Kippur itself when it's done by the high priest. And the question was, well, what comes first? Cleaning out the cups that hold the oil and the wicks of the candelabra, or lighting the incense, the daily incense offering on the incense altar. And we seem to have a contradiction between two Mishnas. And the Gemara basically said, well, the reason we have a contradiction between these two Mishnas is that they reflect the opinions of two different Tanaim, two different rabbis of the Mishnaic period in the history of the oral Torah. Today, we're looking at another such contradiction, which the Gemara offers here, because we're generally talking about the service in the Holy Temple, but specifically where we have a contradiction between two Mishnas, and that the way that it can be resolved is that they reflect the opinions of two different rabbis. As we examine this contradiction, it's going to be a great and wonderful cue. We've been talking so much about what goes on in the temple, moving from here to there, and this chamber and that chamber. And it would be nice to get a little bit of imagery so that we can start to get a sense of what the temple looked like and what was going on where. So I have some visual aids, and we'll start using them momentarily. So beginning at the bottom of the B side of page 15, so just as the contradiction above was resolved by attributing different sources to different Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishnah, the Gemara cites an additional contradiction with a similar resolution. We learned in a Mishnah there, and this is in Tractate Talmud, about the daily offerings. The appointee, which in that case means the deputy high priest, said to the other priests, "Go out and bring a lamb from the chamber of the lambs, where the lambs awaiting sacrifice were kept after they underwent inspection and were found to be without blemish." So the Mishnah continues, where was the chamber of the lambs? The chamber of the lambs was located in the northwest corner of the hall of the hearth in the temple courtyard, and there were 4 chambers there in that hall, and then we're going to start to name those chambers. All right. So let's start to set the scene here. First of all, I don't know why I have such a brain blip when it comes to the kosel, or in Hebrew, Israeli Hebrew, the kotel, meaning the wall, right? The western wall, which is really a retaining wall built by Herod of the Temple Mount, right? It's an outer wall, not even like the wall that really surrounds the temple, the temple courtyards itself, but rather a retaining wall that holds up that whole Temple Mount, that Herod vastly expanded when he sort of made the Second Temple much bigger and more glorious than it had been in the early Second Temple period. Now, my brain blip, because I always think about, I enter the old city of Jerusalem, through that Jaffa gate, and then I head toward my lodestar, my destination, going through the streets of the old city until I reach the wall. And then, I know the Temple Mount is high up above the wall, and further in that same direction. And then if you go further still in that direction, the Mount of Olives is over there. And there's the Mount of Olives cemetery, which occupies all that land now. Okay, so for some reason, I can't explain it to you. I always feel like when I'm headed toward the Western Wall, I'm going north. I'm not going north. For some reason, it just feels like north to me. And then everything gets confusing. But it's not north. It's the Western Wall because it's the Western Wall of the temple compound. So, very simple diagram right here. Am I getting a little reflection? Sorry, let me just get that so you can see it. All right, so just a very simple little diagram here. And what I'm showing here is this right here is the Western Wall plaza, right? So if you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem and you go visit the Western Wall, there's this large plaza with beautiful, smooth stone floor. The wall is at the front of it. There's like a little synagogue inside here. There's some stairs that go up to the Temple Mount. The women's side of the Kotel is over here, right? The women's side is a little smaller than the men's side. So that's like the women's side. That's the men's side. Okay, so this right here is the Western Wall. This is the Western Wall Plaza. It's the part that's left of this whole Western Wall of the Temple Mount. This would have been the temple. This is, not too far away from a good scale. It shows how large the Temple Mount was compared to the temple itself, which is a large building, but, it was a very big Temple Mount, right? So this is surrounded by its courtyards, and we'll get into that in a minute. This was the altar right here. It's facing east, right? The doors of the temple face east. And then when you leave the Temple Mount, and then over here, that's not really to scale, but it's more like over here would be the Mount of Olives, right? And so this right now is a cemetery there. And in the days of the temple, when they would have a red heifer, right, they would slaughter the red heifer here on the Mount of Olives. And there was like literally a bridge that the priest built to walk the red heifer out to make sure that it never came into contact with any kind of impurity. And when it was slaughtered over here on the Mount of Olives, it would be directly opposite the temple. And the temple was tall. Like if it was flat like this, the temple really stood up much taller than anything else on the Temple Mount. And the guy slaughtering the red heifer would have a direct view, and we'll be discussing that today, of the entrance to the Holy Temple. So that's that general layout, right? The whole Western Wall. This is the part of the Western Wall that is standing today. There's the temple facing east, and Mount of Olives is here. All right. Now, okay. Let me see. Okay, so this is a nice representation, and let me see if I can do this without glare, of what the temple looked like. Okay. So there you can see the temple itself is quite tall. It has a very, very tall door, much larger than what the tabernacle had, right? So I think it was Solomon's temple, and I think the second temple had it also, that door was 20 cubits wide and 40 cubits high. And then what you see, right, if we kind of expand it, so the temple courtyard. Okay, so the temple courtyard, the compound, the whole Temple Mount extends this way and that way, right? And so the Western Wall Plaza where we gather now would be kind of over here somewhere, right? And we'd be looking at the, we're facing the back, as it were, of the temple itself. We're going to be talking about the women's courtyard is right here. Will that stay up? That won't stay open. Okay, but this is the women's courtyard right here. These are the 4 chambers that we're going to be discussing today, the 4 chambers off of the women's courtyard. And we're also going to be discussing the chamber of the hearth, and that could be found sort of in the wall. These walls are like very big, right? So it's like the temple is sort of surrounded by a long building. It's not just a wall that surrounds the temple. In these walls, there are rooms, whole rooms. And in fact, like multiple rooms. So it's like really, it's a very large structure. And during a holiday, it would be just very crowded, and there were people up on these ramparts, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Here there's a kind of a boundary, like when Gentiles would come and they wanted to send in an offering, they would be limited to how close they can get, right? So there's going to be always these distinctions made. Non-Jews can get only a certain way close to the building. The women can go in here. The men can go a little bit closer. And now we'll get to that in a second. And of course, it's the priests who can really get close, right? So that was the building is like that. And now we go over here, and this is a kind of overhead diagram. Hopefully you can see this, right? An overhead diagram. Okay, let me get up a little closer. I'm sorry about the lighting. It makes this challenging. Okay. And so what we have here, right, is so this is the women's courtyard, and these the 4 chambers that surround it. Okay. So here we have all right, so that's the women's courtyard and the 4 chambers which surround it. This is the temple itself over here. This is going to be the Holy of Holies back here, where only the high priest could go on Yom Kippur. This is the sanctuary in front of it that has the inner altar. Hold on a second, what's going on? Okay, here we go. This is the Holy of Holies. That's the sanctuary. This is the outer altar, and this is where the majority of the animal sacrifices would be brought, right there. Let's get a little pointer. Would be brought on that altar right here. This is where the slaughtering of the animals was done. This courtyard of the Israelites, right, where the Israelite men could go, it's very narrow. It's just this little strip right here. A lot of people could fit there, but it's still very narrow. Women's courtyard, much bigger. And so that gives you some sense of the geography that we're going to be talking about. And this chamber right here, next to the building itself, right? This is the Holy of Holies here. And that represents the curtain in front of it. That's the sanctuary. And this room right here is what we're talking about right now. This is the Hall of the Hearth, and it has 4 smaller rooms that open into that hearth, and that's what we're talking about right now. So the Hall of the Hearth is right here. So that's east, right this way. This is west. So this is north right here. So the Hall of the Hearth is in the north, just to the north of the building. Okay. So hopefully that paints a little bit of the picture, and we'll try to refer back to that as needed. Okay, so we're going to have a contradiction between a Mishna in Tractate Talmud about the geography of that Hall of the Hearth, just to the north of the sanctuary, of the entrance to the sanctuary. And a contradiction in Tractate Talmud versus a Mishnah in Tractate Midot about that Hall of the Hearth and the rooms that open into it. Okay, so the Chamber of the Lambs, so once we're talking about this Chamber of the Lambs in Tractate Talmud, It says that the chamber of the lambs was located in the northwest corner of the hall of the hearth in the temple courtyard. And there were 4 chambers there in that hall. One was the chamber of the lambs, one was the chamber of the seals, another was the chamber of the hall of the hearth, and one was the chamber where the showbread was prepared. So in this hall of the hearth, that's just to the north of the entrance to the sanctuary, the hearth, what is that? It's a fire, right? It's a nice fire. Remember, it gets quite cold in Jerusalem in the winter. It can even snow. It snowed last year. And the priests who serve in the temple, when they do their avodah, when they do the divine service, when they bring offerings or incense offerings or slaughter animals or whatever they do in the temple compound, they need to do that with their body in contact with the ground of the temple courtyard, meaning they serve barefoot. They don't wear shoes, they don't wear sandals, even in the winter. So needless to say, they need a place where they can get warm. So when the priests aren't outside doing their service, they're usually to be found in this hall of the hearth, right? So this is the hangout, the chill room of the priests when they're serving in the temple. What were the 4 chambers that opened into the hall of the hearth? One was there was the chamber of the lambs, right? And so when animals were kept that were going to be brought as offerings, first they would be examined to make sure that they're free of blemishes. That was in today's reading. You can't bring an animal that has a blemish onto the altar. So they get examined. Okay, somebody brought this animal. It's going to be offered. It is blemish free. It's ready to be offered. But, there's a line of animals that need to be offered on the altar, so it's not quite time yet. Where do they put it? In the chamber of the lambs. Then there's the chamber of the showbread. The showbreads are these 12 loaves of unleavened bread, but they're soft, but they're big and folded over. And there's 12 of them that sit on the table of the showbreads all week long. One of the miracles of the temple, at least the first temple, is that they would stay warm and fresh all week long. And then they would be replaced on Shabbos, and the priests who were serving that day, it was one of their privileges to eat from the showbread. Then there's the smaller chamber of the hearth that opens into the hall of the hearth. And that would be for priests, who needed a little bit of privacy and also wanted to stay warm, or maybe it was even a little bit warmer. And then there was the chamber of the seals. This does not refer to, seals like sea lions, but rather the seals, which were, I called them tokens when we discussed this in Tractate Shekalim. But when people came to the temple and had not already purchased an animal for their sacrifice, or had not already purchased the oil or the wine or the water, well, not the water, but the oil or the wine libations or the meal offerings that would accompany their offering, they could purchase it in the temple. And how would that work? They would purchase it in one place by this token, and then they would it's called a seal, and they would take that seal to another place in the temple and then, trade it in for whatever they were buying, right? The animal offering or the libations which accompany the offering. So this chamber of the seals was, instrumental in that process. And the Gemara raises a contradiction between this Mishna from Tractate Tamid and another Mishna from Tractate Midot. Because in that tractate it says that there were 4 chambers that open into the hall of the hearth, like semi-open rooms that open into a central hall. 2 of these chambers were located in the sacred area in the temple courtyard, and 2 of the chambers were located in the non-sacred area of the temple. How is that possible? That these rooms could be in the non-sacred area? And it's because these rooms were built into this, thick wall which surrounds the temple. So we're talking about rooms that were built right in here into this very thick wall that surrounded the temple. And there's like a line sort of down the middle of that wall where outside that line, you're not in the sacred precincts of the temple, and inside that line, you are. And so that's going to require a different level of vigilance in how the priests conduct themselves, whether they're actually in the sacred compound of the temple or actually outside of it. Right? They're still on the Temple Mount, but they're not in the temple, the precincts of the temple itself. So there's a lesser level of holiness over that line. So says the Gemara, where am I? 2 of these chambers were in the sacred area and of the temple courtyard, and 2 of the chambers were located in the non-sacred area of the Temple Mount. Where am I? Of the Temple Mount. Sorry, just had a little distraction there. Of the temple courtyard, and 2 were not in the non-sacred area of the Temple Mount. And the tops of wooden stakes in the hall of the hearth divided between the sacred area and the non-sacred area to apprise the people in both areas where they were located and what conduct is required. And what purpose did these chambers serve? The southwest chamber was the chamber of the lambs. The southeast chamber of the hall of the hearth was the chamber in which the showbread was prepared. The northeast chamber was the chamber in which the Hasmoneans sequestered the altar stones that were desecrated by the Greek kings, or here it says the Gentile kings, when they sacrificed idolatrous offerings. And the northwest chamber was the chamber in which the priest descended through the tunnels to the hall of immersion. So there is a contradiction between the sources with regard to the location of the chamber of the lambs. So what between the 2 sources, we have a contradiction of where the chamber of the lambs is. We also have a contradiction about the identity of 2 of the rooms. According to the Mishna and Tractate Talmud, the 4 rooms that open into the hall of the hearth was the chamber of the lambs, the chamber of the showbread, the chamber of the hearth, the smaller chamber of the hearth, and the chamber of the seals. According to the Mishna and Tractate Midot, the 4 chambers are the chamber of the lambs, the chamber of the showbread, that's like those 2, but the chamber of the lambs is placed in a different corner. But then the other 2 have a different identity. One is the altar stones, and the other is the chamber that has the stairs that lead down to the chamber of immersion, meaning the mikvah. So when the priests needed to immerse themselves, to purify themselves in the mikvah, they would go down, to this kind of underground room. There were tunnels that included a mikvah for them to immerse in. So perhaps, there was a stairway within one of these other rooms, either the smaller chamber of the hearth or the chamber of the seals, and maybe the other room, either the small chamber of the hearth or the chamber of the seals, ended up being used for the storage of the altar stones. Now, what is this thing of the altar stones? Very interesting. We know that if we look at the story of Hanukkah, right? So there was a rebellion against the Syrian Greeks who had sought to impose their law over the land of Israel and not kill all the Jews, but prevent us from observing the obligations of Torah. They wanted to eradicate not the Jews, but Judaism, but Torah observance, right? And unfortunately, there were a lot of Jews who went along with that, right? It was the whole story of Hanukkah is actually a war against the foreigners who wanted to, destroy Judaism, but they were assisted in large part, and that war was made possible by all these assimilated Jews who wanted to join, this very civilized Greek society with all its wonderful philosophy and gymnasia and Olympics and sports and etc. and all their heathen practices. And then it was that there was the Hasmonean revolt led by Matisyahu, the high priest, and then eventually that family, the Hasmonean family, after they won the war, they became the kings of Israel. And once they won the war and recaptured the temple, that's when they found, this one container of oil that should have only lasted for one day, but it was able to keep the menorah, the candelabrum, burning for 8 days. while the temple had been captured by the bad guys, right? Particularly this Greek army that had taken over. They did the unspeakable and sacrificed swine on the altar of the food of God, on the holy altar in the holy temple, where you could only bring kosher animals that were in a state of purity, had been examined for no blemish, etc. For so many centuries. They came in, they put a pig on the altar, they slaughtered it, they burned it, and they offered it to their pantheon of gods or Zeus or whatever, and desecrated the altar with the blood of the swine and that offering in a way that was just absolutely intolerable to us and to our tradition. So the altar had to be dismantled and replaced with new stones to have a new altar where we could continue to bring our sacrifices, but we couldn't bring our sacrifices on an altar that had been defiled in that way. So once it was defiled, it could no longer serve as the altar. The stones of the old altar could no longer be used as the altar. However, you can't just throw them out because those stones had been used to bring the holiest offerings on behalf of the nation of Israel. It had attained a level of holiness, so even though it had become desecrated, you can't dismiss the level of holiness which it had attained. It can no longer be used for the sacrifices, but it can't just be thrown away, destroyed, mined, thrown into a quarry, ground into powder, whatever. What would they do with it? So they dismantled the altar and they stored the stones in one of these chambers in the temple compound, saying that when Mashiach comes, when Eliyahu Hanavi comes, the prophet Elijah, to announce the coming of the Messiah, like many unanswered questions in our tradition, Elijah will tell us what to do with questions that we can't figure out on our own. The sages don't have an answer for it. What should we do with those stones? So we just store them, and Elijah will tell us what to do with them at that time. And those were the chamber of the altar stones. Rav Huna said, who is the Tana? Who is the rabbi who taught the Mishnayos, the Mishnas in Tractate Midot? It is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who has a different opinion with regard to this matter. As we learned in a Mishnah there in Tractate Midot, the dimensions of the women's courtyard were a length of 135 cubits by a width of 135 cubits. So now we're talking about the women's courtyard. Okay, so here we're talking about this area. Get the reflections out of the way. So we're talking about this area here at the foot of these outer stairs. This is the women's courtyard, and there are 4 chambers. 1, 2, and then you can't quite see them behind the wall, 3 and 4. But you can see them better in this diagram. So here we have the women's courtyard, and this is 135 cubits by 135 cubits. Here, 135 cubits by 135 cubits, and we're discussing these 4 chambers around the women's courtyard. So as we learned there, the dimensions of the women's courtyard were a length of 135 cubits by a width of 135 cubits, and there were 4 chambers in its 4 corners. And what purpose did these chambers serve? The southeast chamber was the chamber of the Nazarites, those who had taken a vow not to partake of wine or to cut their hair or to impurify themselves through contact with the dead during the days of their Nazirus. They would take that vow for a finite amount of time, and then when the period of their Nazirus ended, they would go and shave their heads and give their hair as an offering along with the other offerings that they're obligated to bring when the period of, this is an optional thing to become a Nazir, but if having done it, having taken that vow, at the end, you shave off all your hair and bring these offerings, and they would prepare for that in the chamber of the Nazarites. As there, the Nazarites took their peace offerings and shaved their hair and cast it into the fire to burn beneath the pot in which the peace offering was cooked, as the Torah instructs in Numbers 6:18. The northeast corner, the northeast chamber, was the chamber of the woodshed, where blemished priests who were disqualified for any other service stand and examine the logs. So we talked about that yesterday, that some priests would have a physical blemish and they would be disqualified from bringing offerings up on the altar, but they could still serve in the temple compound. And what could they do? They could examine the wood before it was taken out to the altar pyre where the burnt offerings were burned. And so the northeast chamber was the chamber of the woodshed, where blemished priests stand and examine the logs to determine if they were infested by worms, as any log in which there are worms is disqualified for use on the altar. Lest we think, oh, wow, the poor blemished priests, they got screwed and they can only do such a menial job examining the wood for worms. Okay, well, other priests, all they got to do was, clean out the dirty oil and ash from the candelabrum or sweep the ashes off the altar. Everybody was doing, this menial work, but because it was such important work and done on behalf of the nation, it was a privilege to them and they were honored to do it. The northwest chamber was the chamber of the lepers. Again, biblical lepers, people with tzara'as, who would immerse for their purification. With regard to the southwest chamber, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said, I forgot what purpose it would serve. Abba Shaul says they would place wine and oil there for the meal offerings and libations, and it was called the chamber of the house of oils. Now, from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said this is what the three of the rooms were about, and I can't remember what the fourth one was, tells us that the identity of these rooms is according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And since that Mishna follows on or includes the earlier Mishna about the identity of the four rooms that open into the chamber of the hearth, so then we know that the identity of the rooms and the location of the rooms on the hearth, around the hearth, is according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. I'm almost done for what we're going to cover today. So if you've got questions or comments, get them in. So too, it is reasonable to conclude that the Mishnayos, the Mishnas in Tractate Midot, are in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. As we learned in a Mishnah there, all the walls that were there surrounding the Temple Mount were high, except for the eastern wall, as the priest who burns the red heifer stands on the Mount of Olives, where the red heifer was slaughtered and burned, and he directs his attention and looks toward the entrance of the sanctuary when he sprinkles the blood. And so to have a view from the Mount of Olives all the way across this, bridge that was constructed specially for this purpose to slaughter the red heifer and burn it, and then bring those ashes back, for him to have a view of the front door, as it were, of the temple, the wall that separates the courtyard of the priests, followed by the courtyard of the Israelites, and then a wall separates that from the courtyard of the women. That wall has to be lower than other walls, and the east wall of the temple compound also has to be a little lower, so that you have this unobstructed view from the Mount of Olives to the sanctuary. That's where we're going to finish our discussion today. There's more discussion on this page, if you want to read it, about the heights of the walls and the heights of the entrances around the compound. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time and get into much greater detail about all of the various chambers and entrances and tunnels and passages and courtyards around the temple compound. It's beyond the scope of today's class, but if it's something you're curious about, there's a wonderful website, templeinstitute.org. Let me double check that. templeinstitute.org, which will give you a virtual tour of what the temple compound was like, both the first temple of Solomon and the second temple in the early second temple period, and then when it was vastly expanded by Herod in the late second temple period. and then you can get a sense of this geography. And then if anybody else has that same silly brain blip that I've had, right, now you know that the Western Wall, it's called the Western Wall, and when we're praying at the Western Wall, right, and we're praying to God. We don't pray to a wall. We don't pray to a temple. We only pray to God, but we pray in a location that allows us to be as close as possible to where the Holy Temple stood. When we're at that wall, we are facing east. And if we could, be like one of the pigeons that lives in that wall and just kind of fly up to the top of the wall, we'd be looking out across that Temple Mount. And if we continue to look east, we would see the Mount of Olives across the way. If we rose to the top of the wall and we're looking east, if the temple was standing, it wouldn't be right in front of us. It would actually be to the left of where we'd be. Because the wall that we recognize now as the Western Wall is sort of toward the right end of that Temple Mount, meaning if you're facing east, and it's more to the right, so it's like the south. It's south of center, as it were, and therefore south of where the temple itself would be. And that's why when you take a tour of the tunnels of the Temple Mount, right, you enter the Western Wall Plaza, and then you make a left to go inside that building where the tours begin, and then they walk you toward the north, right, and a little bit to the east, and then you get to a spot where you're as close as you can be today without actually going on top of the Temple Mount. And it's problematic for Jews to walk up there, not only because of the politics of the situation, but also because of the restrictions that our sages imposed of walking on the Temple Mount, because you could accidentally walk over the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, and you don't want to do that. So it's problematic. Jews do it. It's problematic politically. It's problematic religiously. There are ways to do it. If that's something that interests you, read what it says about visiting the Temple Mount in templeinstitute.org. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check comments and questions. Yehudit, this depiction was excellent. Thank you, Sal. People appreciate the visual aid. I'm glad. I'm very glad. I really need like a better, board for this purpose that's tuned to the camera. But at any rate, hopefully it was visible enough. Bill, this problem of the stones feels a bit, so this is the idea that the altar stones that were desecrated by the Greeks who slaughtered a pig there to their god, and then we had to dismantle it so that we could, and then rebuild the altar after the Hanukkah War. So the problem of the stones feels a bit like the religious equivalent of the question of what to do with nuclear waste. Though one certainly hopes the Messianic age will come sooner than the end of the plutonium's half-life. Phil, you always have a good take on things. Absolutely. I do believe that when Mashiach comes, along with eradicating disease and bodily defects and deformities and problems, and resurrecting the dead, I think the world has to become a beautiful and very habitable place. So presumably all that nuclear waste will get taken care of as well. Caroline, what were typical routines or goings on that were happening in the women's courtyard? The temple was very busy. The main business of the temple was people bringing offerings, right? So people bringing these offerings and bringing them to the priests who would offer them. But women had special needs in terms of the offerings, because remember that any woman who had a child is supposed to bring an offering, right? They're offerings for bearing children. So, there's just a lot of women who had offerings to bring. There were bird offerings, there were meal offerings, there were a lot of offerings to bring. But in terms of that more daily life of the temple, we'll come to that when we get to those offerings and we study them in greater detail. And finally, Bill, there are no menial jobs in worship, only menial thoughts. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. And a good place to end. Thank you, my holy brothers and sisters. I hope you've enjoyed this class. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 17 here in Tractate Yoma. Have a great night.